You've probably heard the term circular economy thrown around a few times recently. It presents a nice idea. It makes us imagine a world filled with sustainable products, sustainable energy sources, and a thriving economy at peace with a thriving environment. Now, as an engineer working in manufacturing, I can't really speak to this entire economic model, but it did lead me to wonder about what manufacturers are actually responsible for. So currently, when a product goes to market, this concept of life cycle design is a popular one. But when I did some research onto modern product lifecycle methods, the product end of life is rarely even mentioned unless it's for compliance with the EU's new extended producer responsibility laws. So today I'm going to do an ethical analysis on just this question. Are manufacturers and designers responsible for planning what happens to their product when it's done being used? This is an ethical analysis video for Kennesaw State University's MTRE 6750 course. If you pause and look around your house, you'll be hard-pressed to find much that hasn't been impacted by massive manufacturing. Since the Industrial Revolution, humanity has been able to produce things faster and more consistently than ever before. We know this brought prices down, and it made things that used to be luxuries available to more and more people. Today, after decades of massive scale manufacturing, our standards of living have been higher than ever before. This all came at a cost, though. It seems like almost every day there's some new environmental crisis. Plastic in the ocean, dangerous chemicals found in products, microplastics being found in food and water. Even if you make an effort to be sustainable as a consumer, it seems impossible to find everything that you need without some piece of it being completely unrecyclable. For example, maybe you ordered something online and it came in a cardboard box. Seems easy enough to recycle, but then you learn the shipping label isn't recyclable. You got a receipt on your latest shopping trip, so that's paper, right? Seems easy enough, but turns out it has a plastic coating and can't be recycled. It seems like for most of us, what we buy, the manufacturer didn't even consider what you were meant to do with it after use, regardless of your otherwise sustainable intentions. There's a concept that enjoyed a bit of a flashpoint of popularity back in the 2000s called Cradle-to-cradle. Popularized by William McDonough, it's an idea that advocates for design and manufacturing practices that have their complete life cycle designed. When someone sits down to work on developing a new piece of technology or toy, they need to have a plan for not only how to make it, but also what will happen to it when it is no longer being used. This is an idea that fits really nicely into the larger circular economy idea, but focuses mostly on manufacturing and product design. Cradle-to-Cradle argues that manufacturers are responsible for product end of life and advocates for really looking at what's being sold and interpreting intention from these actions. If a rubber duck has chemicals known to cause cancer in California and it's being sold as a children's toy, what does this say about product intention? If the product is sold as eco-friendly because it has a paper shell, but the bottle is still non-recyclable plastic, what does that say about this product's intention? Let's take a look at an example of a product with good end-of-life design. This company, Mushroom Packaging, aims to provide a sustainable solution to product packaging. Everything they make is grown from mushrooms into a mold, providing packing options with desirable properties for packaging. However, there is one catch. As many of us have seen when trying to identify sustainable alternatives, it does come at a premium. When comparing this mushroom packaging product to a comparable product that is not sustainably designed, we can see that the more eco-friendly options is about 3 times as expensive. Now let's take a look at some case studies related to this subject. One case study conducted in South Africa evaluated the area's manufacturing industry and found that the biggest impact to driving product end of life was cost reduction from reclaimed materials. Another study, focusing on the impact of EPR, found that product EOL wasn't so important as long as producers were required to pay a fine for recycling or otherwise outsource the material reclamation process. Finally, there was a circular economy study done in China, but the study concluded that the jury was still out. There have been some pilot industrial parks started there, but we are yet to see how those industrial parks will fare. I've done quite a bit of digging, and I found a mountain of resources talking about why sustainable design hasn't happened yet, how to do it, the consequences of not doing so, However, I haven't found any academic ethical analysis or critique on whether or not manufacturers are even responsible for product end of life. But there are plenty of non-ethical analysis papers on this subject, so let's take a look at some that are generally advocating for the practice and some that raise concerns. As far as papers that were in favor of manufacturer responsibility, by far the most prominent is the original Cradle-to-Cradle study conducted alongside William McDonough. It argued that products must be made with repurposement baked into their design. They made the point that eco-efficiency just delays the problem of natural resource depletion, and what they call eco-effectiveness is the solution. There are also some interesting studies on a rebound effect that happens when efficiency is pursued in favor of effectiveness. I don't have time to dive into those in this video, but if you're interested, the sources are all available below. There are a number of other studies supporting the concept proposed by Cradle-to-Cradle, citing the necessity of decoupling economic growth from natural resource strain if we want to continue the prosperous manufacturing industries that we see today. There are several papers listing concerns about this approach. The most dominant concern is the practical viability of cradle-to-cradle and effective sustainable design. One study found that NDAs interfered with the spread of valuable information and technology and said that this would be a major hindrance going forward if cradle-to-cradle is ever going to work. Another study described how ideas like cradle-to-cradle fail to consider important socio-ethical issues and don't consider consequences such as prices ultimately just being passed off to the consumer. There have also been concerns expressed about trying to implement sustainable design by law, as some studies show that government regulations can sometimes have the opposite effect of what they were originally trying to accomplish. So let's move into our ethical analysis of manufacturer responsibility as far as product end-of-life design. We're going to be conducting an analysis using the three dominant ethical theories in Western society. We're going to start with virtue ethics, move into deontology, and wrap up with utilitarianism. Let's get started with virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is an ethical theory originally founded by Aristotle. It's an agent-based approach that encourages the individual to pursue being a virtuous person by habit. It extols this idea of the golden mean, which is a balance between extremes. Think cowardice and foolhardiness, arrogance and insecurity. The best things are found in the middle, such as being courageous, confident, and so on. The main virtues that we'll be using for today's analysis are prudence, generosity, and courage. So let's go virtue by virtue. Starting with prudence, this virtue might say that if we continue to deplete our resources, we will run out. This means that companies won't be able to operate anymore, so it would seem prudent to act accordingly. However, if they try to transition too quickly, they may become uncompetitive compared to companies that aren't trying, which could make that operation also considered imprudent. That didn't really clear things up, so let's see if any other virtues help. Our next virtue is generosity. According to Aristotle's definition of generosity, it's having an inclination to give, but knowing when you're not able to. It advises against being extravagant, although I'm not sure that's really a possibility here. If companies decided to let margins get a little smaller in the name of sustainability, are they giving when they're not able to? I think it depends on the individual manufacturer here too, so this virtue hasn't really cleared things up. Looking at our final virtue, we're going with the Aristotelian definition of courage. Courage is doing something scary when you know you're able to, but if you know you can't, you get help. So if we try to apply this to the manufacturer, the evaluation also seems to change from agent to agent and changes depending on the situation. Maybe a better application is looking at individual product designers and asking how can they as individuals behave virtuously. But would this not put their families at risk if they try to shake the boat too much? Overall, it seems that virtue ethics asks manufacturers to do what they can to the extent that they're able to. As mentioned before, another facet of virtue theory is asking whether an agent is engaging in virtuous behavior as a habit. So, if a manufacturer is making a habit of progressing towards better complete life cycle design, then maybe we could consider this virtuous behavior. Deontology, sometimes called Kantian ethical theory, is a duty-based approach to ethics. It uses universal rules such as do not lie or do not steal. It doesn't evaluate consequence and only focuses on intention. It involves this idea of the categorical imperative. Often, deontological analysis asks that we try to identify the primary motivation for an action and consider what it would mean if this were applied to everyone. In other words, we extract the motive to some sort of universal law and evaluate if it makes sense from there. Kant originally came up with 4 formations of the categorical imperative, but we'll just be using this one for today. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end, and never as a mere means. For a deontological analysis, we have to evaluate the maxim or the motive of manufacturers. Then we have to determine if this behavior is ultimately treating humanity as a means to an end, or if humanity is the ultimate end here. Since deontology demands evaluation based on intention alone, it makes it challenging to answer this question at point blank. When we see manufacturers creating products that cannot be recycled or otherwise actively harm the environment, in my opinion, there are 2 possible readings of this. First, there's the possible good faith reading. If we go with this, then when we see a company producing environmentally harmful products, then we could suppose that their intention is really just to ensure that they can keep the doors open and not leave their employees without jobs. Making a product sustainable is hard, and the increased cost either puts more pressure on the maker or ultimately gets passed off to the consumer, making them less competitive. If we try to extract this to some kind of universal law, maybe it would sound like it's okay to produce economically harmful products if that's the only option. Now we're stuck with a bit of a sticky situation because we have to be able to define how dire things have to be in order to declare this route as the only option. But it does leave room for discretion between manufacturers depending on their situation. This potential universal law turns around to point a finger at manufacturers that are able to behave more sustainably but are choosing not to. Personally, I think this is a pretty balanced conclusion to come to, and it's also a great segue to the bad faith reading. The bad faith reading, which involves interpreting the actions of manufacturers with bad product end-of-life design as them simply not caring about what happens to their product after its use. They continue to make products cheaply so that they can just keep earning more. If we try to extract this to some kind of universal maxim, it might go along the lines of it's okay to ignore what happens to a product after use if it's profitable. This universal maxim or universal law does fail to pass Kant's categorical imperative test, since ultimately this perspective is treating humanity and our environment as a means to the end of profit. Let's move on to our next ethical theory. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that, contrary to deontology, focuses completely on consequence rather than intention. An action is evaluated by its impact and its impact alone. Often this leads to a form of ethical calculus, where an ethical analyst is tasked with comparing the total sum of human suffering caused and the total sum of human flourishing caused by any given action. At first glance, utilitarianism would suggest that failure to design a product for its end results in more human suffering caused by more polluting waste. But as we've seen, designing sustainable products is expensive and could harm how competitive a company is if the market isn't ready to pay the difference. If you shrink the timescale of your scope, utilitarianism could seem to suggest that transitioning from non-sustainable to sustainable approaches isn't the best if it would cause that company to fail, ultimately resulting in lost employment. What utilitarianism does seem to mandate is that manufacturers must do what's best for man, which, in this case, can kind of demand that we see the future. There are plenty of concerns about the viability of manufacturers designing for sustainability. Our current market is at least somewhat built on sustainability, never having been a cost we've had to deal with, since it's always just been so easy to dump it somewhere and figure that we'll deal with it tomorrow. Since no one can see the future, it seems that the main thing utilitarianism demands is to pursue net maximum human benefit to the extent that's possible. It tolerates short-term suffering caused by increases in pricing attributed to more sustainable product design, since by utilitarianism standard, it's all in exchange for the prevention of enormous human suffering in the future. Personally, I think with the data that we have, the most utilitarian thing for a manufacturer and designer to do would be plot the best paths that they can towards sustainable practices and proceed there as quickly as possible. However, what's possible will vary. It seems that all 3 of the theories that we talked about today are in favor of manufacturers at least considering what the end of product life looks like for what they're making. To virtue ethics, this is the long-term prudent thing to do with their business. Prudence also demands that things be done carefully, as moving too quickly could leave a lot of people priced out of necessities. Generosity demands that they work together with other companies and maybe share discoveries and publish techniques that help this goal become more attainable. Encourage demands that they at least try the best that they can. Deontology requires manufacturers and designers to take a look at their products and evaluate their intentions. If their product can't be recycled or composted, what does this say about their intentions? Are they doing this just to stay afloat or just because it's profitable? Deontology seems to expect that manufacturers do what they can to the extent that they're able to, all with the intention of making a happier humanity their goal. Utilitarianism requires that they take every possible action to minimize human suffering and maximize human flourishing. As such, it seems to be mostly in agreement with our other discussed theories. Manufacturers and designers should do everything they can to bake the product end of life into their designs and planning, or at least try to get there as quickly as possible. This is the best way for them to maximize long-term flourishing, but as to how quickly utilitarianism demands the transition, I think depends. There is a strong argument for the immediate enormous human suffering that could be caused by things like companies going under because of increased costs, job losses, and a general increase to the cost of, well, just about everything. I think there's a solid case of utilitarianism to advocate for a metered transition that tries to limit the consequences of a rapid switch towards more sustainable product design. Once again, this has been an ethical analysis video for Kennesaw State University's MTRE 6750 course. Thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to feedback.